The morning begins with routine. A thin mist sits low over the coastal plain. Factory whistles carry across narrow streets and wooden houses. Women in work uniforms walk toward assembly halls and warehouses, their steps measured by long months of rationing and air raid drills. Fishing boats move slowly beyond the breakwater. The sea appears calm, almost empty. There is no visible fleet on the horizon, no warning of ships, no approaching formation large enough to be seen from shore. Then comes the sound. At first, it is faint, a distant vibration layered over the wind. The kind of sound many had learned to measure carefully. Not yet sirens, not yet explosions. Engines. Multiple engines. High and fast. By the time lookouts and civil defense observers begin to react, the aircraft are already overhead, descending from altitude in tight formations launched hours earlier from American carriers far beyond the visible coastline. Sirens begin seconds too late. Shadows cross factory roofs. People look upward. For many civilians, especially women working in coastal towns and industrial districts, the attack feels as if it has arrived without warning. Sudden, mechanical, and impossibly distant from any visible battlefield. The aircraft have come from the sea, and the sea has revealed nothing until the last moment. Behind them, far beyond the horizon, the carriers are already turning into the wind again. By the time American carrier aircraft began appearing over the Japanese home islands in 1945, the nature of naval warfare had already changed beyond recognition. The transformation had begun years earlier, long before civilians along Japan's coast would hear the sudden approach of engines from unseen ships. In the early decades of the 20th century, naval power still revolved around battleships. Large caliber guns, thick armor, and visible fleets defined military strength at sea. Aircraft carriers existed, but many senior officers in the world's major navies still saw them as support vessels rather than decisive weapons. That assumption began to shift in the late 1930s as aircraft range, payload, and coordination improved. Japan had been among the first nations to recognize the offensive potential of naval aviation. The Imperial Japanese Navy developed carrier strike doctrine with unusual seriousness during the interwar period. Pilots trained for long-range operations. Deck crews practiced rapid launches. Aircraft were modified for torpedo attacks and precision bombing. By 1941, Japan possessed one of the most capable carrier forces in the world. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated carrier-based air power. 6 Japanese carriers launched hundreds of aircraft in successive waves against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The strike did not destroy American aircraft carriers. They were absent from port, but it revealed the vulnerability of even heavily defended naval bases to sudden aerial assault launched from far beyond the visible horizon. The distance between ships and targets had become less relevant than the reach of aircraft. In the years that followed, the Pacific War unfolded across enormous distances. Aircraft carriers became the central instruments of naval combat. Battles such as the Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June 1942 were fought primarily through aircraft launched from carriers rather than direct gunfire between fleets. At Midway, American carrier aircraft sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a matter of hours, a loss from which Japan's naval aviation arm never fully recovered. Industrial capacity soon became as important as tactical innovation. The United States possessed a vast manufacturing base capable of producing ships, aircraft, and trained crews on a scale few nations could match. Beginning in 1943, American shipyards launched a steady stream of fleet carriers and smaller escort carriers. At the same time, aircraft production expanded dramatically. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes rolled off assembly lines in numbers that allowed for sustained operations across the Pacific. Training and doctrine evolved alongside production. American naval aviators practiced coordinated strikes involving dozens or even hundreds of aircraft. Carrier task forces learned to operate as fast-moving groups, screened by cruisers and destroyers and supported by oilers that enabled long-range operations. Radar systems improved detection and interception capabilities. communications procedures became more standardized, allowing multiple carriers to launch complex strike packages in rapid succession. By 1944, the United States Navy had formed large carrier groups capable of operating together as a single offensive force. These formations would later be known as Task Force 58 when operating under the 5th Fleet and Task Force 38 under the 3rd Fleet. The designation changed depending on command rotation, but the ships and aircraft remained largely the same. Their purpose was clear: project sustained air power across vast ocean distances and bring the war closer to Japan's remaining territories and, eventually, the Japanese homeland itself. Japan, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. Losses in carrier battles, the destruction of experienced pilots, and increasing shortages of fuel and materials strained the Imperial Navy. Aircraft production continued, but training programs shortened as experienced instructors were lost. Defensive preparations on the home islands intensified, yet resources were limited. Radar coverage existed, but was uneven, and early warning systems often struggled to detect fast-moving carrier aircraft launched from unexpected directions. By late 1944, American forces had advanced across the Central and Western Pacific. The Mariana Islands fell, providing bases for long-range bombers. The Philippines campaign cut vital supply lines. The Japanese Navy suffered heavy losses in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and subsequent engagements. Carrier aviation, once a Japanese strength, had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. The war was moving steadily toward Japan's doorstep. As American carrier groups pushed westward, the distance between open ocean and the Japanese home islands grew smaller. Aircraft launched from carriers hundreds of miles away could now reach coastal cities, industrial centers, and military installations with increasing frequency. For civilians living in those areas, especially in coastal regions, the war still often felt distant in early stages. Air raid drills were common, and civil defense preparations intensified, but the idea that aircraft could appear suddenly from beyond the horizon without visible fleets nearby remained difficult to grasp. Traditional expectations of naval warfare involved ships that could be seen, tracked, and anticipated. Carrier warfare did not always offer such warning. Aircraft could launch before dawn, climb to altitude, and approach targets from unexpected directions. By the time observers heard engines, the strike might already be underway. This new reality would become more apparent as American carrier operations intensified in the final phase of the Pacific War. And as the front lines moved ever closer to Japan's home waters, the routines of daily life along the coast would soon intersect with the reach of carrier-based aviation in ways that few had fully anticipated. By the closing months of 1944, the strategic map of the Pacific had shifted decisively. American forces had secured the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands provided airfields for long-range bombers that could reach Japan directly. At the same time, naval forces advanced through the Philippines, severing critical supply routes between Japan and its remaining territories in Southeast Asia. The Japanese military faced pressure on multiple fronts, from submarines, from strategic bombing, and from carrier-based airstrikes. The development of the Fast Carrier Task Force marked a significant evolution in American naval operations. Instead of operating individual carriers or small groups, the U.S. Navy organized large formations of fleet carriers supported by light carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and logistical vessels. These task forces could move quickly across the Pacific, launching coordinated strikes against targets hundreds of miles inland, and then repositioning before effective counterattacks could be mounted. Task Force 58, operating under Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet, and later Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet, became the principal instruments of this strategy. Their aircraft included fighters such as the F-6F Hellcat and later the F-4U Corsair, dive bombers like the SB-2C Helldiver, and torpedo planes such as the TBF Avenger. Each carrier could launch dozens of aircraft in rapid sequence, and when multiple carriers operated together, the number of planes in a single strike wave could exceed several hundred. These formations were supported by an extensive logistical network. Fleet oilers refueled ships at sea, allowing the task forces to remain on station for extended periods. Ammunition ships and supply vessels provided bombs, fuel, and spare parts. Radar picket ships extended detection ranges. This logistical backbone enabled sustained operations near the Japanese home islands without requiring immediate access to nearby bases. Japan's defensive preparations intensified as the war approached its final phase. Coastal observation posts, radar installations, and air defense units attempted to monitor potential approaches. However, resource shortages affected radar coverage and aircraft availability. Fuel scarcity limited training and operational flights. Many experienced pilots had been lost earlier in the war, and replacement crews often had less training time. Anti-aircraft defenses existed around major cities and industrial areas, but the scale of American air power presented a growing challenge. Civilian mobilization became an essential part of Japan's wartime effort. Women played a significant role in factories producing aircraft components, munitions, and equipment. Others worked in transportation, communications, and civil defense roles. Urban and coastal communities conducted regular air raid drills. Shelters were constructed, though not always sufficient for the scale of potential attacks. Schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods organized response procedures intended to provide warning and protection. Despite these preparations, the nature of carrier-based attacks often compressed warning times. Aircraft could launch from positions far beyond the visible horizon, especially if carriers operated under cover of weather or darkness. Radar might detect incoming formations, but the time between detection and arrival could be brief. In some cases, the first indication of an approaching strike came from the sound of engines overhead or the appearance of aircraft descending through cloud cover. In February 1945, American carrier forces launched major strikes against Tokyo and surrounding areas. These operations demonstrated that carrier-based aircraft could reach the Japanese capital itself. Further raids targeted industrial facilities, airfields, and transportation networks across the home islands. The goal was to weaken Japan's ability to continue the war and to support forthcoming operations, such as the invasion of Okinawa. The Okinawa Campaign, beginning in April 1945, brought American naval forces even closer to Japan. Carrier aircraft conducted daily sorties against military targets across Kyushu and other regions. Japanese defenses responded with fighter interceptions and, increasingly, with organized kamikaze attacks against the fleet. The intensity of operations around Okinawa highlighted the scale of air power now being deployed on both sides. For civilians within Japan, especially in coastal and industrial areas, the presence of American aircraft became more frequent. Some raids were preceded by sirens and warnings. Others seemed to arrive suddenly, the aircraft appearing over cities or harbors with little visible indication of the carriers that had launched them. The distance between the ships and the targets, combined with the speed of aircraft, created a sense that attacks could emerge from an unseen source beyond the horizon. Women working in factories and ports often experienced these raids during routine shifts. Production lines continued despite shortages and disruptions. Civil defense teams stood ready, but the unpredictability of carrier strikes meant that alarms sometimes came only moments before aircraft appeared overhead. The contrast between ordinary daily activity and sudden aerial attack became a defining feature of life in the final months of the war. As American carrier task forces continued to operate near Japan's home waters, the tempo of strikes increased. Aircraft launched in waves, sometimes before dawn, sometimes under cloud cover, sometimes from positions chosen to complicate detection. The result was a new form of pressure on Japan's defensive system and civilian population, one defined by speed, distance, and the capacity of carriers to project air power without immediate visibility. This evolving situation would shape how both military planners and civilians experienced the closing phase of the Pacific War. The technology and doctrine developed over years of conflict were now converging near Japan's shores, setting the stage for moments when the arrival of aircraft seemed almost instantaneous, the product of forces operating far beyond the visible horizon. The growing presence of carrier-based aviation over Japan would not only test defenses and infrastructure, but also reshape perceptions of distance and security in wartime. Human angle: women in wartime Japan. By 1945, the Japanese home islands were a nation under constant pressure. Civilian life had been reshaped by years of total war. Women, in particular, bore much of the burden of sustaining industry and society. They staffed factories producing aircraft components, munitions, and essential machinery. Others served in transportation, communications, and civil defense. Workdays were long, rationing was strict, and air raid drills punctuated the rhythm of daily life. When American carrier aircraft suddenly appeared over coastal towns, women in factories and harbors were among the first to witness them. Many had been trained to respond to sirens and warnings, but the speed of carrier-launched attacks meant that in some cases, the first alert came not from a siren, but from the sound of distant engines growing louder by the second. The sensation was one of instantaneous intrusion. The war, which had often seemed abstract or distant, arrived in moments. Accounts from factory records and post-war surveys indicate that this unpredictability left civilians disoriented. Women responsible for guiding evacuation, managing production lines, or protecting children had to make split-second decisions. Some continued their duties under threat, while others sought shelter with little more than seconds to spare. The psychological impact of seeing aircraft appear without warning cannot be overstated. It contributed to a pervasive sense of vulnerability and awe. These experiences illustrate the intersection of warfare and civilian life. The human element, particularly the female perspective, which dominated industrial and civil sectors, provides insight into how sudden, technologically advanced attacks reshaped daily routines and perceptions of safety in Japan during the final year of the war. Technological angle: carrier launch speed and surprise. Carrier warfare in the Pacific had evolved to maximize speed and operational surprise. American fleet carriers were equipped to launch dozens of aircraft within minutes. Flight decks were designed for rapid sortie preparation, with crews trained to refuel, arm, and launch planes under strict timing protocols. The integration of radar and advanced communications allowed task forces to coordinate multiple carriers simultaneously, creating strike waves that could overwhelm local defenses. By 1945, this technology had reached a level of operational sophistication that rendered traditional early warning measures increasingly ineffective. Aircraft could be launched hundreds of miles from Japanese shores, climb to altitude, and approach targets from unexpected directions. Radar installations on land sometimes detected aircraft only when they were within striking distance, leaving civilians and local defenses with minimal time to react. The combination of speed, coordination, and technological efficiency allowed American forces to strike with an almost theatrical suddenness. For Japanese observers, particularly women in industrial areas, the appearance of aircraft overhead often seemed instantaneous, as if planes had emerged from nowhere. The reality was the product of meticulous planning, advanced logistics, and highly trained crews executing complex maneuvers far from the reach of visible observation. These technological factors transformed warfare into a form of controlled unpredictability, emphasizing surprise, rapid response, and the projection of power across vast distances. The result was a heightened psychological effect on both military and civilian populations, as traditional cues of naval engagement, visible fleets approaching convoys or pre-strike reconnaissance, were largely absent in these operations. Operational angle: U.S. Naval Aviation Doctrine. The success of American carrier operations stemmed not only from technology, but also from doctrine and strategic planning. Task Force 58, under the Fifth Fleet, emphasized mobility, speed, and concentration of force. Carriers moved in groups that provided mutual support, allowing airstrikes to be launched in multiple waves while minimizing exposure to Japanese counterattacks. Doctrine dictated that aircraft be prepared for immediate deployment, with coordinated timing to maximize the element of surprise. Strike packages often included fighters for air superiority, dive bombers for precise attacks, and torpedo bombers targeting vessels or infrastructure. Pilots trained rigorously in navigation, formation flying, and timing to ensure that aircraft from multiple carriers arrived on target simultaneously. Operational planning extended beyond the carriers themselves. Intelligence gathering identified critical targets, including industrial centers, transportation hubs, and airfields. Meteorological reports guided launch times to exploit cloud cover or weather conditions favorable for concealment. Even minor details, such as deck crew rotation or aircraft armament sequences, were optimized to minimize delays. The combination of doctrine, training, and operational planning allowed carrier-based attacks to arrive with precision and speed. From the perspective of civilians witnessing the raids, these strikes appeared as sudden, overwhelming events, emphasizing both the tactical acumen of the U.S. Navy and the stark contrast with Japanese early warning capabilities. Japanese defense angle, radar and interception limits. By 1945, Japan had developed radar networks along key coastal regions, but these systems were limited in coverage and capability. Early warning radars could detect large formations, yet the approach of fast, high-flying aircraft from distant carriers often exceeded the practical range of detection. Many stations suffered from maintenance shortages, power fluctuations, and operator inexperience due to the prolonged war. Fighter interception faced similar challenges. With a dwindling pool of trained pilots and aircraft in limited numbers, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces struggled to respond effectively. Aircraft stationed at home islands often needed to scramble quickly, but by the time they reached altitude, American planes had already begun their attack runs. The timing advantage of carrier-launched waves, combined with coordinated planning, allowed U.S. forces to strike before Japanese interceptors could be organized. The limits of Japanese radar and air defense not only reduced the effectiveness of military response, but also amplified the psychological impact on civilians. Coastal communities, harbor workers, and factory employees observed aircraft descending seemingly without warning, giving the impression of omnipresent, unstoppable force. This gap between perception and reality underscored the technological and strategic advantage held by American carrier task forces. Psychological angle. Shock of sudden strikes. For civilians, particularly women responsible for managing families, factories, and workplaces, the sudden arrival of American carrier aircraft was profoundly disorienting. Repeated drills and prior warning systems provided a sense of preparedness, yet the unpredictable timing of attacks disrupted routines and heightened stress levels. Account from post-war surveys highlight the emotional toll. Many women recalled moments of disbelief, confusion, and fear as planes appeared overhead with engines roaring before any alarms could be sounded. The suddenness created an almost cinematic experience. The war, once abstract and distant, became immediate and unavoidable. Psychologically, this had multiple effects. Some civilians maintained operations despite the threat, driven by a combination of duty, necessity, and fear. Others fled to shelters or attempted to protect children and colleagues. The unpredictability of the attacks reinforced a sense of vulnerability and underscored the superiority of the attacking forces, contributing to a gradual erosion of morale in the civilian population. Strategic angle. Pressure on Japan's homeland. The sustained carrier operations in early to mid-1945 exerted unprecedented strategic pressure on Japan. Attacks targeted industrial centers, transportation infrastructure, and urban areas critical to war production. Each strike weakened Japan's capacity to supply troops, repair aircraft, or maintain effective coastal defense. By striking with speed and unpredictability, American forces forced Japanese military planners to allocate resources across multiple locations simultaneously, diluting defensive effectiveness. Women in factories, as the backbone of production, experienced the direct consequences. Intermittent shutdowns, hurried evacuations, and repeated exposure to the stress of aerial assault. Strategically, these operations fulfilled multiple objectives, degrading Japan's industrial output, creating psychological strain, and demonstrating the reach and mobility of American naval power. The cumulative effect of these strikes accelerated Japan's vulnerability, making subsequent operations, including the planned invasion of the home islands, increasingly feasible. By early 1945, the Fast Carrier Task Force had begun sustained operations against the Japanese home islands. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, operated off the coast of Honshu and Kyushu. Its carriers, Enterprise, Essex, Yorktown, and others, formed the nucleus of a striking force capable of launching hundreds of aircraft in rapid succession. Supporting cruisers, destroyers, and oilers allowed the task force to remain on station far from land, invisible to casual observation. On the morning of February 16, 1945, radar stations along the southern coast of Kyushu detected faint blips hundreds of miles offshore. Civilian early warning networks had little chance to interpret these signals accurately. At first light, fighter and bomber squadrons were already in the air, launched in multiple waves with precise timing. For women working in industrial districts along the coast, the first indication of the attack was auditory, the distant roar of engines growing steadily louder over minutes. Within moments, aircraft appeared over rooftops, descending through scattered morning clouds. Factory whistles competed with anti-aircraft fire, though Japanese artillery struggled to target fast-moving, high-altitude aircraft effectively. The strike targeted industrial plants producing aircraft components and fuel. Bombs were dropped with precision informed by extensive reconnaissance. Damage was significant, halting production for days in some locations. Civilians sought shelter, while workers attempted to continue essential tasks under the stress of the attack. The sudden appearance of aircraft, seemingly from nowhere, reinforced the impression that American forces could strike at will, carriers launching planes without prior warning. Meanwhile, American pilots executed disciplined attack patterns. Fighters suppressed enemy air response, while dive bombers and torpedo planes engaged designated industrial and transportation targets. Coordination across multiple carriers allowed successive waves to arrive with minimal gaps, maintaining constant pressure. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed, both by the speed of the aircraft and by the limitations of radar detection. The operational tempo of the task force was relentless. Aircraft launched, struck, and returned in cycles, creating a continuous threat over several hours. Civilians observed these movements with growing alarm. Women working in factories, warehouses, and coastal transport facilities had to balance immediate survival with maintaining essential wartime operations. Many witnessed aircraft striking targets near their workplaces, emphasizing the immediacy and proximity of the conflict. Reports after the attacks indicated that some industrial centers suffered extensive structural damage. Transportation networks, rail yards, ports, and docks were disrupted, delaying supply lines and complicating the movement of personnel and materials. The cumulative effect of repeated carrier raids strained both the logistical and psychological capacity of Japan's home defense apparatus. These operations marked a turning point in naval warfare and the Pacific Campaign. The speed, scale, and surprise of carrier-launched strikes demonstrated the strategic dominance of the U.S. Navy. They emphasized that battles could now be fought hundreds of miles from visible fleets, with civilians and defenders experiencing attacks that seemed instantaneous. The precision of coordination, the technological sophistication of aircraft, and the operational doctrine enabling these raids created a new reality for Japan. Civilian observers, particularly women integral to industrial and civil efforts, witnessed the power of American naval aviation in ways that underscored both vulnerability and the impossibility of fully anticipating attacks. The next phase of operations would push these dynamics even further, with increased tempo, broader targets, and escalating consequences for both military and civilian populations. Following the initial strikes in February, American carrier operations intensified in March and April 1945. Task Force 58, now operating with additional carriers and support vessels, conducted repeated raids along southern Honshu and Kyushu, targeting urban centers, industrial complexes, and airfields. The tempo of these operations left Japanese defenses struggling to respond effectively. Aircraft were launched in meticulously timed waves. Fighters established air superiority. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers struck industrial and military targets, and reconnaissance planes ensured follow-up attacks maintained accuracy. The coordination across multiple carriers allowed a continuous stream of aircraft to reach Japan's home waters, often from unexpected directions. Civilians witnessed aircraft seemingly materializing from the horizon, engines loud and shadows moving across urban landscapes before alarms could sound. Industrial centers bore the brunt of the attacks. Factories producing aircraft, ships, and munitions suffered direct hits. Rail yards, ports, and fuel depots were targeted to disrupt supply lines. The Japanese war economy, already strained by material shortages, fuel rationing, and previous air raids, now faced systematic disruption from strikes launched hundreds of miles offshore. Women working in factories were directly affected. Production lines halted, shelters became temporary workplaces, and evacuation routes were utilized repeatedly in a matter of hours. Anti-aircraft defenses engaged the attackers, but Japanese gunners struggled with the speed, altitude, and coordination of the incoming waves. Radar detection, limited in range and coverage, provided short warning times. Interceptor aircraft often reached altitude too late, arriving after bomb runs had been completed. The operational advantages of American carrier doctrine were evident. Launch sequences, flight coordination, and target prioritization allowed task forces to operate with precision and minimize exposure to Japanese counterattacks. The psychological impact on civilians intensified with each raid. Women, responsible for factory supervision, civil defense coordination, and household management, reported heightened stress and disorientation. Sudden attacks blurred the distinction between front lines and home territories, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The combination of surprise, speed, and destructive capacity reinforced the perception that the attackers could strike at will. Naval and military records confirmed the effectiveness of these operations. By April 1945, reports from the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy noted repeated disruptions to industrial output, delays in transportation, and a collapse of localized air defense response in several regions. Civilian evacuation and sheltering became routine, yet the frequency of attacks made complete preparedness impossible. The American carrier's ability to launch aircraft without visible presence ensured that attacks maintained the element of surprise. This period marked the operational peak of carrier-launched strikes on Japan's home islands. Aircraft could arrive from the horizon, inflict significant material damage, and return to carriers before countermeasures were fully deployed. The combination of strategic planning, technological advantage, and operational discipline underscored the decisive role of carrier warfare in the Pacific theater. By the conclusion of these raids, the cumulative effect was clear. Japan's defensive infrastructure was weakened, civilian morale was strained, and the overwhelming reach of American naval aviation reshaped the experience of warfare on the home islands. The stage was set for the final months of conflict, where the convergence of industrial destruction, strategic pressure, and human endurance would define the closing phase of the Pacific War. By mid-1945, the sustained carrier strikes had left a visible mark on Japan's coastal and industrial regions. Cities such as Nagasaki, Kobe, and smaller industrial towns along southern Honshu and Kyushu experienced repeated aerial bombardment. Factories producing aircraft components, munitions, and essential military equipment were frequently halted. The loss of productivity created immediate logistical challenges, as supply lines and manufacturing schedules could no longer meet the demands of a nation already stretched thin by years of war. Casualties among civilians were significant, particularly among women and children in industrial zones. Air raid shelters offered protection, but many structures were insufficient for the scale of the attacks. Women working in factories faced difficult choices: remain at their posts under threat or evacuate, leaving critical production incomplete. Post-war surveys documented that the stress of repeated sudden strikes had a profound psychological impact on civilian women, creating heightened anxiety, exhaustion, and fear. Infrastructure suffered as well. Rail yards and ports, critical for transporting materials and military supplies, were prime targets for carrier-launched aircraft. Bombing disrupted the movement of raw materials and finished products, forcing improvisation in both military and civilian logistics. Fuel depots, essential for maintaining the limited operations of the Imperial Navy and Army, were frequently damaged, compounding shortages. Roads and bridges were also affected, impeding emergency response and evacuation efforts. Japanese military assessments acknowledged the operational efficiency of the American task forces. Reports highlighted the speed, coordination, and unpredictability of the carrier-based attacks, noting that even fully prepared defenses often could not respond in time. Interception attempts by fighters were frequently too late, and anti-aircraft artillery proved largely ineffective against high-altitude strikes and tightly coordinated attack waves. Beyond material and tactical effects, the raids demonstrated the psychological reach of the U.S. Navy. Civilians witnessing aircraft descending from the horizon, seemingly without warning, experienced a sense of powerlessness that undermined morale. Women, particularly in coastal towns and industrial districts, were at the forefront of this experience, both as observers and participants in maintaining production and civil defense. In combination, the immediate consequences of these operations set the stage for broader strategic outcomes. The repeated disruption of Japan's industrial base, the strain on civil defense and infrastructure, and the growing psychological toll contributed to a situation in which the homeland was increasingly vulnerable to subsequent operations. By late spring 1945, the cumulative effect of repeated carrier launch attacks was unmistakable. Japan's industrial capacity had been severely diminished. Factories essential to aircraft production, naval repair, and munitions manufacturing were either destroyed or operating at a fraction of their previous capacity. Rail and port infrastructure, repeatedly targeted, struggled to maintain supply lines critical to both military and civilian operations. The strategic pressure applied by these operations extended beyond physical destruction. Japanese leadership faced a stark reality. Their homeland was within range of sustained, rapid, and unpredictable strikes from a sea. The inability to reliably detect or intercept carrier-based aircraft exposed vulnerabilities in Japan's defensive planning. For military commanders, the attacks revealed that conventional coastal observation and radar networks were insufficient to counter the speed and coordination of modern naval aviation. Civilian life reflected these pressures. Women, who constituted the majority of factory workers, civil defense personnel, and auxiliary staff, bore the brunt of repeated raids. Work continued under constant threat. Shelters were used repeatedly, and the psychological strain of unpredictability compounded physical exhaustion. Post-war accounts indicate that repeated exposure to surprise attacks contributed to elevated stress levels and a pervasive sense of vulnerability among civilian populations. The broader impact on Japan's war effort was profound. Carrier strikes disrupted production schedules, delayed the movement of troops and supplies, and weakened the capacity of cities to sustain extended defensive operations. Strategic bombing combined with carrier-based raids created overlapping pressure on infrastructure, forcing Japan to allocate scarce resources to defense while simultaneously coping with damaged production and transportation networks. From the perspective of the Pacific War, these operations demonstrated the decisive role of carrier task forces in projecting power over vast distances. The ability to launch multiple waves of aircraft from ships positioned hundreds of miles offshore rendered traditional early warning systems and static coastal defenses largely ineffective. This operational dominance accelerated Japan's path toward surrender by undermining both material capacity and civilian morale. The stage was now set for the final months of the conflict. Japan's defensive options were increasingly limited. The psychological and material effects of sustained carrier strikes, coupled with impending strategic bombing campaigns and the threat of invasion, underscored the inevitability of decisive Allied action. Civilians, particularly women who had been integral to sustaining the industrial and social structure, would witness the convergence of technological, operational, and strategic pressure in a way that reshaped the experience of warfare in the home islands. The decisive impact of these operations led directly to Japan's vulnerability in the closing months, setting the stage for reflection on both the human and technological dimensions of modern warfare. The carrier strikes on Japan's home islands in 1945 marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but also in the history of modern naval warfare. Aircraft launched from ships hundreds of miles offshore could reach cities, factories, and ports with precision and speed that traditional defenses could not counter. For civilians, particularly women working in factories, harbors, and civil defense roles, the experience was immediate and unforgettable. Aircraft appearing from the horizon with engines roaring, buildings shaking under the force of bombs, and lives disrupted in moments. These operations revealed the convergence of technology, doctrine, and human endurance. The American Navy's ability to coordinate carriers, aircraft, and logistical support across vast distances demonstrated the transformative power of industrialized warfare. At the same time, the human element, the women managing production lines, guiding evacuations, and maintaining essential services, highlighted resilience under unprecedented pressure. Their reactions, a mix of fear, astonishment, and determination, provide a vivid lens through which to understand the civilian experience of war. Strategically, carrier warfare had redefined the meaning of distance and security. Japan's traditional assumption that its homeland was protected by geography no longer held. The sudden appearance of aircraft, seemingly from nowhere, emphasized the reach and unpredictability of modern naval power. The psychological impact of these strikes, combined with the tangible destruction of industry and infrastructure, accelerated the decline of Japan's ability to sustain prolonged conflict. Ultimately, these operations offer a sobering reflection on the evolving nature of war. Technology and strategy can project force across oceans, but the human experience, the shock, resilience, and endurance of those under fire, remains central. The sight of American carrier aircraft descending on coastal towns, disrupting daily life, and challenging both military and civilian preparedness is a reminder that the history of warfare is shaped equally by innovation and by the people who live through it. The lessons endure. Speed, coordination, and technological mastery can alter the course of conflict, but the human experience, the awe, the fear, the determination, remains the most enduring record of war.